The human fleet's warp drives flashed to life. The Galactic Council headquarters were visible through the viewports. Inside the station, the stench of fear emanated from the quivering Noron diplomats. Karos shifted in his seat, wiping sweat from his brow. I warned those idiots not to touch the humans' pets. Remember the Zorgun and the cats? Deb Barkle-Tro grimaced and leaned forward. The Kalani massacred that Terran's dog to send a message. Fools. I heard the human diplomat Bobby Russell look their ambassador in the eyes and said, "You messed up worse than you can imagine," then walked out. Spirits help us, Karos whispered hoarsely. Those psychopaths may be new council members, but you've heard the stories. First Contact, the Kalani sent a war fleet. The humans destroyed 30 ships before they surrendered. The Kalani are enforcers for centuries. Tren shuddered. We mocked the Terrans for keeping pets, but that bond is sacred to them, as serious as any. A chime sounded. The chamber doors opened. Karos met Tren's eyes, seeing his own unease reflected there. They stood on shaking legs and stepped forward into the Grand Council room to face judgment. An icy dread gripped Karos's chest, colder than the void of space. The wrath of humanity was upon them. The Council's folly would doom them all. As the 1,000 alien eyes watched, a question hung unspoken: what terrible vengeance would the humans unleash for the murder of a single cherished dog? Karos and Tren entered the council chamber with trepidation. The human delegation was already seated, Bobby Russell at the center, his expression stony, his eyes filled with a cold, simmering rage. Karos leaned over to Tren. Look at the human's eyes. I've never seen such a cold fury before, Karos whispered. Tren nodded, murmuring back, I heard one of the Kalani soldiers who was there when they killed the dog said that Russell had tears streaming down his face as he cradled the dog's body, even though he wasn't making a sound. But then he looked up at the Kalani with those same eyes he has now. And the soldier said he felt a chill run through his whole body. As the council session began, the Kalani ambassador stood to give his testimony, defending his soldier's actions in killing the dog. Russell listened silently, his piercing gaze never leaving the Kalani. The Kalani ambassador droned on, arguing that the dog's death was merely unintentional collateral damage in a military operation. Suddenly, Russell spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the chamber. Unintentional? Then why did your soldiers pose for hollows with my dog's corpse? Why did they mutilate his body and string up the pieces as a war warning to the humans? No, you intentionally killed a defenseless creature to make a point. But let me make a point of my own. Russell made a small gesture, and a massive holo projection filled the center of the room, depicting an enormous fleet of heavily armed human warships, far beyond anything the council races possessed. Tren gasped. That's not possible. I thought humans only had a dozen capital ships. Where did this fleet come from? Karos hissed under his breath. Russell spoke again, his voice hard as steel. This is the price for your point, Ambassador. This is humanity's answer to your cruelty. We do not want conflict, but we are more than prepared for it. I suggest you think very carefully about your next actions because our first action was building this fleet. Our next will be using it. The council chamber erupted into chaos, a cacophony of raised voices and fearful exclamations. As Russell sat back down, his point resoundingly made, Karos and Tren looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Spirits save us. What have we unleashed? Karos murmured. I told them, I warned them all. The humans are not to be trifled with. Tren could only nod mutely, his eyes still fixed on the holo of the human armada, the image seared into his mind. How could the humans have hidden? The council chamber buzzed with consternation. The revelation of humanity's hidden armada sent shock waves through the assembled diplomats. An emergency recess was hurriedly called, and the various delegations began to file out in a daze. Karos grabbed Tren's arm, pulling him away from the throng and into a quiet corner. Tren was trembling, his eyes wide with shock. Did you see the specs on those human ships? Tren stammered, his voice shaking. Their smallest frigate is as big as our heavy cruisers. And those weapons, I've never seen anything like them. Karos nodded grimly, his own face ashen. I knew the humans were holding back, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. He paused, his brow furrowing. And did you catch what Russell said? Our first action was building this fleet. First action, implying they have more surprises waiting. Tren's eyes widened even further, if that were possible. You don't think they have even more than this, do you? Karos shrugged, his expression bleak. I wouldn't put it past them. We've all underestimated the humans from the start. We thought their lack of aggression meant they were weak, but maybe they simply don't start fights because they know they'll always finish them. Tren shook his head in disbelief. All this over a dog? I still can't wrap my head around it. Karos let out a humorless laugh. That's because you're thinking like a Noran. To us, a pet is a convenient companion, but to humans, that dog might as well have been Russell's child, and we all know how fiercely humans protect their children. Tren fell silent, considering this. The implications were staggering. He had always thought of the humans as soft, even naive, but now he was starting to see that perhaps their restraint had been a choice, not a necessity. After a long moment, Tren spoke again, his voice quiet. What do you think the council will do now? Karos sighed heavily, the weight of the situation seeming to settle on his shoulders. I don't know, but I do know that if they don't handle this correctly, if they push the humans too far, we could be looking at a war that will shake the very foundations of the galaxy. He met Tren's gaze, his eyes grave. And after seeing that fleet, I'm not sure it's a war we can win. The council chamber fell deathly silent in the wake of Russell's revelation. Karos and Tren sat stunned, their minds reeling as they tried to process the sheer scale of the carnage they had just witnessed. Tren leaned over to Karos, his voice a hoarse whisper. 10,000 Zorgon soldiers against a single human battalion. It's unthinkable. The Zorgons are the most feared warriors in the galaxy. How could the humans have defeated them so utterly? Karos shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the hollow of the blood-soaked battlefield. I don't know, but one thing is clear. We have grossly underestimated the humans. Their technology, their tactics, their sheer ruthlessness in battle. It's beyond anything we've ever seen. Tren nodded, a shudder running through his body. And to think all of this because of a dog, a single, solitary pet. If this is how the humans respond to the death of an animal, what would they do if we ever truly wronged them? Karos didn't answer. He couldn't. The thought was too terrifying to contemplate. In the center of the chamber, Russell stood calmly, his point made with brutal clarity. He surveyed the silent, shell-shocked council members, his gaze finally coming to rest on the Kelani ambassador. I trust this demonstration has made our position clear, Russell said, his voice echoing in the stillness. We come to this council in peace, but make no mistake, we are prepared for war, and as you can see, we are very, very good at it. With that, Russell turned on his heel and strode from the chamber, his delegation falling into step behind him. They left a room full of traumatized diplomats, each pondering the same horrifying question: what would happen if they ever faced humanity's full might? Tren turned to Karos, his face ashen. We cannot afford to make an enemy of the humans. We must find a way to make this right, to atone for the Kelani's mistake. Because if we don't, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But Karos understood. They all did. The holo of the Battle of Harris Prime still hovered in the center of the room, a silent testament to humanity's terrible power. It was a power they all now feared, a power they knew they could never hope to match. The humans had shown their hand, and it was a hand that held the fate of the galaxy itself. Karos closed his eyes, a feeling of despair washing over him. The council had awoken a sleeping giant, and now they could only pray that they could find a way to lull it back to slumber. Because if they failed, if they pushed the humans too far, it would be the end of everything they had ever known. In the deafening silence that followed Russell's declaration, Karos and Tren sat rigid, barely daring to breathe. The weight of the humans' words hung in the air, a palpable force that seemed to press down on the entire chamber. Karos leaned over to Tren, his voice a barely audible whisper. Did you see the presidents?